480,000 pounds of dead iron sat on a single rail line in Missouri, and two locomotives with 3,000 combined horsepower could not move it 1 inch. A steel cable 2 inches thick snapped and put a dent in a grain car. 3 days later, the thing that finally moved it weighed less than 9,000 pounds, ran on a magneto ignition, and had been bought secondhand in 1953 for $810. Here is exactly how it happened at Mill Haven Junction, and why the man who laughed loudest ended up writing a check with his own hand shaking slightly around the pen. Earl Gantry was 61 years old, and he had a way of standing at a fence that made him look like he had grown there. Hat in both hands. Weight settled back on his heels. Watching. His hands told most of his story before he ever opened his mouth. Cracked across the knuckles from 40 years of wire and steel and cold mornings. Thumbnail on the right hand permanently flattened from a hammer strike in 1958. He never bothered explaining to anyone. He wore the same style of chambray shirt his father had worn. Sleeves rolled to a precise 2 turns, not 3, because his father had rolled them that way, and Earl had never seen a reason to change it. He farmed 220 acres outside Mill Haven. His father had farmed that same ground before him, and his father's father before that. 3 generations pressed into the same rolling hill country, the kind of land that did not announce itself the way flat prairie did, but punished any man or machine that came at it wrong. Earl did not insert himself into other men's emergencies. That was not stubbornness. It was a rule he had lived by since he was young enough to learn it from his father, who believed a man who spoke before he understood a problem was worth less than a man who said nothing at all. So when the trouble started at the rail yard, Earl watched from the fence, and he said nothing, because nobody had asked him. There was a rhythm to Earl's mornings that had not changed in 21 years. He walked to the barn before the heat came up, boots crunching the same path across the gravel he'd worn smooth over 2 decades. He checked the oil on the same red tractor every single time he ran her, whether she needed it or not, because his father had taught him that a machine is maintained the way a marriage is maintained, not with grand gestures, but with the small attentions nobody sees. The tractor was a 1950 Farmall M, red as a barn door, worn down to a patina that only honest decades produce. Earl had bought her used in 1953 from a neighbor upgrading to diesel. $810, cash, and a handshake. He had kept her running for 21 years on nothing more complicated than patience. In 1968, he had put deep-lug agricultural tires on her rear wheels, specifically for a creek crossing on his south field that demanded real grip. He adjusted her carburetor himself when it drifted, working by feel more than by gauge, the same way his father had taught him to feel a hitch settle before trusting it with weight. She started on the second pull every morning of her life, without exception, a small daily proof that patient work still counted for something. The men at the Mill Haven Co-op had opinions about that. Not cruel ones exactly. The particular dismissiveness reserved for old equipment kept alive by a man who refused to trade it in. In the fall of 1970, Earl had shown up to help a neighbor pull a stuck grain wagon free, and a younger farmer watching the red Farmall roll down the road had said, loud enough for the group to hear, he brought the antique. It got a laugh. Earl freed the wagon in one attempt and drove home without saying a word about it. That was the shape of the flaw in him, if it was a flaw at all. A stubborn quiet that let other men have the last word, every time, because winning the last word had never once moved a stuck wagon. That was who Earl Gantry was, in the ordinary run of things, before June of 1974 gave the county something to talk about for the next 20 years. The Baldwin was a 1923 steam consolidation, a workhorse that had pulled freight through these hills for 50 years. On a Tuesday morning, it seized in its main drive rod assembly and died on the main line between Mill Haven and Denton Falls, cold, silent, and immovable, its boiler ticking as it cooled the way a body settles after the breath goes out of it. Raymond Colfax, Regional Operations Director for the Midwestern Rail Authority, stood on the platform and told the gathered crowd exactly what he thought of it. That antique is exactly what it looks like, a piece of scrap iron that finally gave up. He straightened his jacket. He said they'd have it cleared in 2 days with a diesel crane. Then he said it again, the way men repeat themselves when they want the words remembered. Nothing moves. 11 days of freight sat frozen on sidings up and down the line. Grain, livestock feed, fertilizer bound for co-ops in 3 counties. The rail authority's own numbers would later show each closed day cost shippers near $14,000 in spoiled goods and delay. By Thursday morning, the engine had already been cold for 36 hours, and the grain in the sun-baked cars had begun to smell faintly of heat and dust. The single diesel crane strong enough to lift the dead engine was committed to a bridge job 40 miles east. 4 more days before it was free. So 2 mechanics from Denton looked the Baldwin over, shook their heads, and confirmed what Colfax already feared. Then the Denton yard sent up 2 diesel switchers, nearly 3,000 horsepower combined, to try a push-pull operation against the dead engine. The first attempt bent a coupler and snapped a 2-inch steel cable, which whipped back across the yard and dented a grain car 2 feet deep. Nobody was hurt, but nobody rushed to reconnect the cable ends afterward either. The second attempt moved the Baldwin 14 inches before the switcher's drive wheels spun helplessly, polishing the rail to a useless shine. Gerald Poole, the Denton Yard's foreman, 30 years in the business, a man who did not say things unless he was certain, walked up to Colfax at the end of that second day. "We cannot move that engine with what we have," he said. "Not on this grade, not with a seized drive assembly locking the wheels. We need the crane, or a wrecker team from St. Louis, and that's 6 days to mobilize." He paused. "I'd go with the crane." Colfax said the crane was already coming. Poole nodded and walked away, and behind the station fence, in the fading light of the second day, Earl Gantry stood with his hat in both hands, still saying nothing, but no longer just watching. He drove home that evening and went straight to his barn without a word to his wife about what he'd seen. By the morning of the third day, the line had been closed 72 hours. 3 livestock shippers had called the district office in a tone that went past complaint. A co-op manager from Harrisville drove out, stood on the platform 20 minutes watching nothing happen, and drove home again. A reporter from the Mill Haven Courier had been on site since noon, notebook mostly empty, watching men stand around a locomotive that refused to cooperate with any of their machinery. Poole tried a third approach, rocking the frozen assembly with the switchers, alternating push and pull in rapid bursts. It moved the engine 6 inches one way, 4 inches back. The seized rod did not free. After 40 minutes, one of the younger crew members climbed down from his cab, sat on the rail ties, and did not get up right away. Nobody told him to. Poole stood and looked at the dead Baldwin for a long time and said nothing at all. Somewhere down the yard, a screen door banged, and a dog trotted the fence line and lay down in what shade the boxcars offered. That was the afternoon Earl Gantry came back. Understanding why requires understanding what he'd been doing those 2 quiet days at the fence. Farm tractors, Earl knew, are built for something the railmen hadn't considered: draft resistance, not raw horsepower. A tractor working a chisel plow through hard clay meets resistance that shifts constantly. Soil packs and releases, roots catch and snap, stone deflects the blade sideways without warning. A machine that survives that work for decades, in the hands of the right operator, develops something close to wisdom. It learns to ease into resistance instead of striking it. Earl had also noticed something specific. The switchers were pulling straight along the rail, feeding every pound of force directly into the seized rod's one locked plane of resistance. The harder they pushed, the harder the seizure pushed back, like a fist meeting a fist. Earl had broken stuck things before. A fence post in 1961 that beat 3 men and a come-along. A buried concrete block in 1967. He had learned the principle from his father. A stuck thing is never pulled straight out. It has to be worked sideways first, its grip broken before it is asked to travel. Pull the Baldwin's front truck at an angle, he reasoned, across the track instead of along it, through a snatch block anchored off axis, and the seized rod would be loaded in a direction it had no resistance prepared for, not overpowered, confused. On the afternoon of the third day, Earl loaded his logging chains and his old steel snatch block into his Ford, hitched a flatbed trailer, drove the Farmall aboard, and headed for the junction. He backed through the yard gate at 2:15, a small red tractor on a trailer, entirely out of place among diesel iron. He climbed down and walked straight to Colfax. "I've got a 1950 Farmall M," he said plainly. "She's in good working order and she'll pull. I believe I can move that engine." The laughter was immediate, and it was not quiet. Colfax made sure Poole and the crew heard it. "A farm tractor," he repeated, letting the words do their own work. He looked the red Farmall over slowly, boots to hood, the way a man looks at something he has already decided is beneath argument. We have 2 diesel locomotives up there, 3,000 combined horsepower that have not moved that engine. We've snapped 2-inch steel cable under this load. He shook his head slowly. A 30-year-old farm tractor, hooked to a 500,000-pound locomotive. Someone in the crew laughed along. Earl did not raise his voice, and he did not look at them. "I understand what it looks like," he said. "You've been pulling against the seizure. I'd pull beside it. Different angle, steady draft, not a surge." Poole walked over, tired and careful. "Explain the angle." Earl did. The seized rod's one plane of resistance. The off-axis pull through a snatch block anchored to the yard's fixed post, loading the seizure sideways so it would flex instead of fight. "And the tractor's right for this because she won't surge," he said. "Diesels give you power in pulses, engage, drive, disengage. Exactly wrong for a frozen assembly. A tractor in low gear gives continuous draft. No shock, just steady pull until something gives." Poole looked at the Baldwin. He looked at the Farmall. He looked at Earl for a long moment. Colfax warned Earl he'd be liable for any damage to rail or anchor post. Earl said he understood and that he wasn't asking for anything for himself, only, if it worked, a small donation to the Mill Haven Historical Preservation Society. Colfax looked at Poole. Poole gave a shrug that held 30 years of rail yard experience and one extremely long week. "Go ahead," Colfax said. Earl unloaded the Farmall slowly, the way he did everything, and idled her near the anchor post while he laid out 2 logging chains rated at 20 tons each, a rigging chain with grab hooks, and the snatch block he'd used since 1958, rated at 15 tons and never once failed. He walked the length of the Baldwin. He knelt at the front truck. He stood and sighted the angle between anchor post and drawbar. He walked the line 3 times, doing arithmetic he'd already done at home the night before, and doing it again, because he always did. Perhaps 30 people were watching now. Poole's crew, the station master, the reporter, 3 shippers, a cluster of townspeople at the fence, some of them men who had laughed at that same tractor rolling down a country road 4 years earlier. One yard man murmured to another, "That tractor weighs what? 8,000 pounds?" "Maybe less," the other said. Neither of them spoke again after that. Earl rigged the snatch block, checked the load rating against the geometry twice, ran the chain from the Farmall's drawbar through the block to the Baldwin's front truck. Tensioned, the chain came off the engine's axis at 30 degrees, not along the track beside it. He climbed onto the seat, engaged the PTO lowest gear, eased the throttle forward 1 position. The chain rose off the ground slowly, the way a chain rises when it is finally taking real weight, and went taut with a deep metallic hum that landed in the chest of everyone standing near the fence before it registered as sound at all. A low note, almost felt more than heard, the way distant thunder is felt before it arrives. The Farmall's engine note dropped 2 registers as the full draft hit the drawbar. The rear lugs bit into gravel. The tractor settled backward against the load, not spinning, not slipping, just settling, the way a good draft animal settles into its collar. Earl held the throttle steady. He did not rush it. His face showed nothing, the same expression he wore checking oil on an ordinary Tuesday, as if 480,000 pounds of dead iron were no different from a stuck fence post. Nothing visible happened. The Baldwin did not move. The chain did not slacken. Colfax checked his watch. Someone in the crowd shifted their weight. A yardman folded his arms. Somewhere behind the fence, a dog barked twice and went quiet, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud against the held-breath silence of 30 people watching a red tractor strain against a locomotive. 2 minutes passed. Then, so small that half the crowd missed it, the Baldwin's front truck moved, less than an inch. The chain's angle changed. Poole, watching nothing but the geometry, saw it instantly and said nothing. Earl opened the throttle 1 notch. The lugs dug deeper. The front end lifted the faintest degree as drawbar load climbed. The exhaust pulsed harder, 1 beat, 2 beats, steady and unbroken, the same rhythm that had pulled chisel plows through clay and wagons up creek banks for 21 straight years. The front truck moved again, a full inch this time, visible to everyone. Then came the sound, long, low, metallic, the grinding release of steel fused by cold and time and the violence of the seizure. The main drive rod shifted 3 inches sideways under the off-axis load, and the Baldwin's rear wheels rolled once, twice, and stopped. But they had rolled. Someone in the crowd said one word, barely audible. Earl did not look up. He opened the throttle another notch. The Farmall's rear end squatted lower, lugs grinding into gravel with a sound like distant thunder, and held. The chains sang, and the Baldwin moved again. Not 2 rotations this time, but 8. Then the wheels were turning continuously, the whole massive engine rolling in the direction of pull, slow as a barge leaving a dock, but rolling, unmistakably rolling. 480,000 pounds of cold iron moving behind a red farm tractor a man had bought used for $810 in 1953. The yardman at the siding switch threw the lever. The Baldwin coasted on its own momentum now, released from the seizure into simple heavy motion, through the switch point and onto the siding, and came to rest with the main line clear. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Then the cheering started, real and loud, from men who had spent 3 days fighting this exact problem and understood precisely what they had just watched. Poole stood with his hat in his hand, having removed it without seeming to notice he had. Earl eased off the throttle, let the engine settle back to its resting idle, and climbed down. He began unhooking chains with the same unhurried care he'd used to rig them, the cheering still rolling around him. Colfax walked up and stopped a few feet away. The yard was loud behind him, but it felt quiet where the two of them stood. "I said it in front of my crew, and that reporter, and half this town," he said. "Called it impossible. Laughed plain and loud. I was wrong about all of it." Earl explained it plainly. The switchers pulling straight into the seizure, shocking it instead of loading it. The tractor's continuous draft instead of diesel surge. The off-axis pull that let the rod break sideways under resistance it had never prepared for. "Same principle as a stuck wagon," he said. "Pull it straight out, and it fights every pound of suction it's built up. Come at it from the side, break the seal first, then it travels." Colfax extended his hand. Earl shook it, and Colfax held it a moment longer than ordinary, not dramatically, just long enough for something to settle between two men that didn't need a name. Colfax wrote a check for $250 against the hood of a work truck, and Earl folded it into his shirt pocket without checking the amount. The main line was clear by 4:30 that afternoon. The first northbound freight in 4 days rolled through by 5, its engineer slowing as he passed the yard, leaning from his cab to look at a red farm tractor parked near the anchor post with chains coiled in a truck bed beside it, and not quite understanding what he was seeing. The Courier ran the story Friday with a photograph of the Farmall in the yard, the Baldwin visible on the siding behind it, Earl's name printed plainly in the second paragraph. He read it once on Sunday at the kitchen table where his wife had set it in front of him, and went out to the barn without saying much about it. The story spread the way such stories travel in rural counties, through co-ops and feed stores and grain elevators and church parking lots, carried by farmers and truckers who had heard that tractor called an antique more than once. Every man who had ever made that comment told this story eventually, and told it accurately, which is the most honest tribute available. Earl farmed another 14 years. He never raised the subject unless someone asked, and when they asked, he answered plainly and moved on. He used the Farmall to pull stumps, to drag equipment out of the creek bottom after the flood of 1979, to free a neighbor's stuck combine on a wet fall morning in 1981 after the neighbor's own newer tractor had spun out and given up. In 1986, with his health beginning to slow him in ways he didn't discuss, Earl brought his son Thomas into the barn on a Sunday afternoon. They ran the Farmall down the lane and back. When the engine had ticked cool again, Earl said, "She pulls left when the draft's heavy. Compensate right on the steering. You'll feel when she's seated right." He looked at his son. "You know what she needs?" Thomas said he did. That was the whole conversation. Everything else had already been said across 30 years of working side by side. Thomas kept her running the same careful way, adjusted the carburetor himself when it drifted, replaced the rear lugs in 1989 with the same pattern his father had always used, kept the logging chains on the same hook, oiled against rust every winter. In the summer of 1993, a county road crew got a grader mired in a creek bank 2 miles outside Mill Haven. A newer 100-horsepower diesel tractor already spun to a standstill against the load. One of the crew half remembered a story about a gantry and a train. The county supervisor drove out and found Thomas in the barn doorway. "Give me 20 minutes to check her over," Thomas said. The geometry at the creek was different. The solution was the same in its bones. Off-axis pull, steady draft, patience before force. The grader came free in 40 minutes, and this time nobody laughed when the old red tractor rolled up. The 1950 Farmall M still sits in that barn. Thomas's daughter, 17 now, has been running her since she was tall enough to reach the throttle. She knows the left pull under heavy draft. She knows the chains and the snatch block and exactly what they're for. On the wall near the barn door hangs a photograph, slightly faded, taken on a Thursday afternoon in June of 1974. A red farm tractor in a railroad yard, a massive dead locomotive on the siding behind it, looking almost absurd against all that iron. That was always the point. Some things do not yield to more power. They yield to the right understanding of where the power needs to go. If your family has a machine like that one, something older folks call outdated and younger folks call a story waiting to happen, write it in the comments below. We read everyone, and some of them become the next film on this channel.